The philosophical insight that explains why smart people are lonely. Imagine walking into a crowded room filled with conversation, laughter, and energy. People are talking about their weekend plans, the latest celebrity gossip, the newest trends. But as you stand there, something feels off. You can engage, you can nod along, you can even participate, but deep down, there's a disconnect. It's like there's an invisible wall between you and them, one they don't even know exists. If you've ever felt this way, you're not alone. And if you've ever wondered why intelligent people often feel lonelier than others, there's a reason for that. It's not arrogance. It's not superior. It's not that you don't want to connect. It's that your mind operates on a frequency most people never tune into. Loneliness is not just about being physically alone. In fact, some of the loneliest people in the world are surrounded by others every single day. True loneliness comes from a lack of understanding, from feeling like the way you see the world is fundamentally different from those around you. And true intelligence, is not just about knowledge or IQ. It's about perception, depth, the ability to see past the surface of things and recognize the complexities, contradictions, and deeper truths that most people either ignore or simply don't notice. But here's the problem: the more you understand, the harder it becomes to relate. Because society is built on shared illusions, unspoken agreements about what matters, what's worth discussing, what's worth chasing. And when you see through those illusions, when you recognize that so much of what people obsess over is trivial, meaningless, or even self-destructive, it creates distance. It makes casual conversation feel empty. It makes small talk feel like static noise. It makes social norms feel like a game that you're no longer sure you want to play. Have you ever tried to express a deep thought, only to be met with blank stares? Have you ever questioned something everyone around you accepted as truth, only to be treated as if you were being difficult, or overthinking, or ruining the mood? That's the curse of awareness. The more you think, the more you see, and the more you see, the harder it becomes to pretend that you don't. But let's take this even deeper. Because the loneliness of intelligence isn't just about struggling to relate to others, it's also about struggling to find meaning. Most people are content with simple pleasures, with surface-level happiness, with distractions that keep them from questioning too much. But intelligent minds crave depth. They crave purpose. They crave something real. And in a world that is designed to keep people entertained rather than enlightened, that kind of mind often feels like an outsider.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
So what does this mean? Are smart people doomed to be lonely forever? Is deep thought a prison that isolates us from the rest of the world? Or is there a way to navigate this loneliness, to turn it into something meaningful, something powerful, something that doesn't just separate us from others, but brings us closer to the kind of connection we truly desire? The isolation of thought, why depth creates distance. Loneliness isn't just about having no one around. It's about having no one who understands, no one who truly sees you, who hears the things you don't say, who recognizes the weight behind your words. And the deeper your mind goes, the more difficult it becomes to find people who can follow. Not because they lack value, not because they aren't capable, but because most people have been conditioned to think in ways that avoid depth rather than embrace it. Society does not reward deep thought. It rewards convenience. It rewards efficiency. It rewards those who can play the game without questioning why the game exists in the first place. And so, from a young age, we are taught to conform to fit into conversations, to follow trends, to believe in systems that were built long before we were born. But intelligence, real intelligence, is inherently disruptive. It questions. It is challenging. It sees the cracks in the foundation and asks, why does no one else notice this? That question is where loneliness begins. Because the more you see, the harder it becomes to ignore. You start to notice the contradictions in people's beliefs, the hypocrisy in their actions, the way they say they want happiness but chase things that only bring them emptiness. You start to realize that most people are not searching for truth, they are searching for comfort. And truth, real truth, is rarely comfortable. Have you ever tried to bring up a deep topic in casual conversation, only to be met with awkward silence? Have you ever shared a thought so profound, so carefully constructed, only to watch it get dismissed, ignored, or misunderstood? It's not because people don't care. It's because most people are not used to thinking in that way. Depth requires effort. It requires a willingness to sit in discomfort, to challenge assumptions, to entertain ideas that may force you to change. And change is terrifying. This is the paradox of intelligence. The more you understand, the more isolated you become. The more you think, the more you realize how much of the world operates on autopilot. People follow routines, traditions, and expectations without questioning them, because questioning them would require them to rebuild their entire worldview. And that is something most people are not willing to do. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Because loneliness is not just about not being understood, it's also about not being needed. Most relationships, most conversations, most social bonds are built on mutual validation. People want to feel seen, heard, and reassured that their way of thinking is correct. But when you think deeply, when you see the world in ways others don't, you often find yourself in a position where you are the one giving understanding rather than receiving it. You listen more than you speak. You observe more than you share. You become the person people turn to for advice, for insight, for guidance, but rarely for connection, because connection requires equality. And when your mind operates on a different level, finding that equality becomes rare. So what's the solution? Should intelligent people simply lower themselves to fit in? Should they suppress their thoughts, dilute their ideas, pretend to care about things they don't care about just to feel less alone? That's what many do. They learn to play the role. They laugh at jokes they don't find funny. They engage in conversations they don't find meaningful. They nod along even when they disagree, because fitting in, even artificially, feels better than being isolated. But that kind of belonging is hollow. It is a temporary escape from loneliness, not a cure for it. And the truth is, the only real way out of this isolation is not to shrink yourself, but to seek out the rare few who are capable of meeting you where you are. The ones who think deeply, who question, who see the world in ways that most don't. They exist. They are just harder to find, because by nature, intelligence is rare. This is the hardest truth to accept if you think differently. If you see the world differently, then by definition, you will not fit in with most people. But that does not mean you will never belong. True belonging is not about being surrounded by people, it is about being surrounded by the right people. The ones who challenge you, who inspire you, who don't just listen to your thoughts but expand upon them. And finding those people requires patience. It requires embracing solitude long enough to avoid settling for shallow connections. It requires being okay with being misunderstood, because the alternative, pretending to be someone you're not, is far worse. So the real question is not how do I stop feeling lonely? The real question is, am I willing to be alone until I find something real? Because loneliness is not just an absence of company, it is an absence of depth. And as difficult as it is far better to be alone in truth than surrounded by people who make you feel even lonelier than solitude ever could. The burden of awareness why thinking deeply can make you unhappy. There's a weight that comes with understanding too much. a heaviness that settles in when you realize that the things that excite most people no longer excite you, that the things that bring them happiness often feel meaningless to you. It's not because you don't want to be happy. It's not because you don't want to connect. It's because once you see the world for what it truly is, it becomes impossible to unsee it. And that changes everything. Happiness, for most people, is rooted in simplicity. It's in routine, in entertainment, in distractions that keep them from thinking too much. They live in the moment, not because they are enlightened, but because thinking too far ahead, questioning too deeply, recognizing the fragility of existence, those things complicate happiness. And so, they don't. They stay within the boundaries of what is comfortable, what is familiar, what is safe. But intelligence, real intelligence, does not allow for that safety. It forces you to see past the illusion, to recognize the patterns, to understand the deeper mechanics of why people do what they do. And that understanding, while powerful, often comes at the cost of joy. Because how can you find joy in things that feel shallow? How can you be excited about things that you know are fleeting? How can you fully engage in a world that feels, at times, like it is running on autopilot, repeating the same cycles of history, of human behavior, of mistakes that could be avoided if only people were willing to think more? That is the burden of awareness. The more you know, the harder it becomes to be content with what is. The more you see, the harder it becomes to ignore the flaws in the system, in people, in life itself. This is why intelligence often leads to existential dread. The more deeply you think, the more you realize that most of what people chase, money, status, validation, is ultimately meaningless in the grand scheme of things. You realize that life is short, that time is slipping away, that everything you build will one day be forgotten. And while others can push those thoughts away, can distract themselves with entertainment, with social life, with trivial pursuits, your mind does not let you. Your mind demands answers to questions that have no easy answers. Your mind forces you to confront reality in ways that most people never have to. And maybe the hardest part of all is realizing how little control you actually have. Because intelligence does not grant you power, it grants you awareness. Awareness of how fragile everything is, how unpredictable, how little influence you truly have over the chaos of existence. You can think deeply, you can understand the patterns, but you cannot change the fundamental nature of life. And that realization for many is crushing. So what is the solution? How does one escape the loneliness, the frustration, the existential weight that comes with deep thought? The answer is not to think less. That is impossible. Once your mind has expanded, it cannot shrink back down. The answer is to shift the way you think, to stop seeking happiness in the same places others do, and instead redefine what happiness means for you. Maybe happiness is not in chasing excitement, but in appreciating depth. Maybe it is not in being understood by many, but in being understood by a few. Maybe it is not in trying to control the world, but in learning to navigate it with wisdom. Because intelligence is not just about knowledge, it is about adaptation. And the greatest adaptation you can make is learning to exist in a world that does not think like you, without losing yourself in the process. The burden of awareness is heavy, but if carried correctly, it does not have to crush you. It can shape you. It can give you clarity, purpose, a vision of life that is not dependent on illusions, but on truth. And truth, while often painful, is the only thing that lasts. Transcending loneliness, how to turn isolation into strength. Loneliness is not a punishment. It is not a disease to be cured or a flaw to be corrected. It is a state of being that, when understood properly, can lead to the deepest form of self-discovery and personal growth. The problem is that most people see loneliness as something to escape, something to fix as quickly as possible, rather than something to explore. But what if loneliness wasn't a sign that something was wrong with you? What if it was a sign that you were on the verge of something greater? Most people fear being alone because they have never learned how to sit with themselves. They rely on external stimulation, social interactions, entertainment, distractions to keep them from facing the deeper questions that arise in solitude. But intelligence strips away those distractions. It forces you into confrontation with yourself, with your thoughts, with the reality of who you are when no one else is around to validate you. And that can be terrifying, because it means there is nowhere to hide. But here's the truth: the ability to be alone, to exist without constant validation, is one of the greatest strengths a person can have. It means you are no longer dependent on others for your sense of self-worth. It means your happiness is not tied to shallow connections or fleeting approval. It means you have the power to think, to reflect, to grow without needing permission from the world. And most importantly, it means that when you do find connection, it will be real. It will not be based on fear of solitude, but on genuine resonance with another mind. To transcend loneliness, you must first redefine it. Stop seeing it as a lack and start seeing it as an opportunity. An opportunity to cultivate depth, to refine your thoughts, to become the kind of person who does not need to dilute themselves to be accepted. Most people crave belonging so desperately that they sacrifice their authenticity in the process. They fit themselves into molds that were never made for them, just to avoid feeling like an outsider. But true belonging does not come from fitting in, it comes from being fully yourself and allowing the right people to find you. And here's something most people never realize: the loneliest periods of your life are often the most transformative. Because in isolation, you are forced to ask yourself the questions that truly matter. Who am I beyond my relationships? What do I believe beyond what society has taught me? What kind of life do I actually want to create beyond what is expected of me? These are the questions that shape a person. And they are questions that can only be answered in solitude. But that does not mean you are meant to be alone forever. The irony is that the more comfortable you become with solitude, the easier it becomes to connect with others. Because when you no longer need people to fill a void, you can approach relationships with clarity, with strength, with a sense of purpose. You will no longer settle for surface-level interactions because you will have learned the value of depth. You will no longer chase validation because you will have learned that your worth does not depend on how many people understand you. And you will no longer fear being misunderstood because you will have learned that the right people, the ones who truly resonate with you, will always find their way into your life. So what does this mean for you? It means that if you are feeling lonely, if you are struggling to find people who think like you, who see the world the way you do, the answer is not to shrink yourself to fit in. It is to expand yourself even further, to go deeper into your thoughts, into your passions, into the things that make you unique. Because the more you embrace who you truly are, the more likely you are to attract those who are meant to walk this path with you. Loneliness is not the end of the road. It is the beginning of something far greater. It is a challenge, yes, but it is also an invitation to grow, to evolve, to become the kind of person who does not just seek connection, but creates it. And when you reach that point, when you become comfortable in your own mind, when you learn to exist without fear of isolation, you will realize something profound: you were never truly alone to begin with. You were simply waiting to meet yourself.